Good morning, afternoon actually. How many of you here know who IDEO is? Not so many, okay. Christabel and Cairo asked me to come and talk a little bit about IDEO and design for startups. So I'll talk a little bit about myself, my story, a little bit about IDEO, and then a little call to action at the end. So a couple things before I started. I just arrived in Singapore about 3 months ago. I'm the newest member of the IDEO leadership team here in Singapore, and this is brand new content, so we'll see how the timing goes. So a little about me and my Midwest to Southwest journey. So I grew up here in Chicago. My grandfather was a printer. A what? You say? A printer, you know. The guys who print stuff or printed stuff. I moved down to the Southwest to do my first startup. You might ask why. That's where we found the money. I did my first startup there and sold it during the first boom. Went back to business school, get my MBA in strategy and org behavior, and then I moved to Silicon Valley, where I did a couple more companies. An early mentor of mine influenced me significantly about design and the power of design, not just for products, but for services, experiences, organizations, and yes, even countries and societies. Along the way, I taught quite a lot at a number of world-class business schools and engineering schools, but also at some very cutting-edge, smaller MBA programs. One focused on design, the MBA in Design Strategy at CCA, and one focused on sustainability. It was at these smaller schools that we found kind of the edges where things are actually moving forward. So I sit at the intersection of design and business and venture. And you might ask, well, what is that? We've been talking a lot today about product and about problems, but how do you actually figure out what those problems are, and how do you figure out which products are appropriate? I was also frustrated personally in Silicon Valley by the lack of speed and impact I was having. I felt quite comfortable in the Bay. I simply wasn't learning and growing fast enough, and it felt like it was time for a change. So I moved to IDEO. I put myself in a new place, in a new country, in a new region, at what I think is a very interesting time, when people seem ready to act and to challenge the status quo and to co-create the future. As entrepreneurs, or some of you who want to be entrepreneurs, you already are kind of taking this step. We need to kind of figure out how to get the rest of the country up and running and co-creating the future through businesses, through social ventures, through social innovations. So I'll tell you a little bit about IDEO and walk you through some of how we work and try and make the leap to how that impacts startups. A lot of what you'll hear will sound similar to some kinds of customer development, but it's also the way we work as an organization, not just the way we work for product. So design has put IDEO at the forefront of innovation. Now this is a really nice thing for us to have, IDEO on the cover of Business Week, but I'm actually more interested in the fact that design is next to business. In most places, design is next to engineering if we have that conversation at all. So we're trying to start a conversation in Singapore about design and business and the ability to design businesses, not just products or services. This is also the Fast Company 50 list behind here. The nice thing about us being number 14 is fantastic, but the more importantly is the fact that about 35 of those other 50 companies are our clients. So we come from quite diverse backgrounds. We work across multiple industries, multiple clients, multiple opportunities. We don't claim to have an industry expertise. In fact, sometimes our naivete about an industry is actually what gets us, is where our value is. The ability to kind of step back, ask questions that people who are in the industry, who have been in that industry for 10 years, can no longer ask because they're kind of too blindsided. So, but first and foremost, we're inspired by people. You may have heard the term human-centered design. We basically start with not the processes, not the technologies, not even the person necessarily, but the problem and then the person. This is a colleague of mine, Christian, who we had a we had a hospital come and ask us this question: what's our patient experience? It turns out that the guy who was asking this question had a relative who was in the hospital recently. He was the CEO of a major health chain. That person, his relative, someone he cared about, was quite dissatisfied with the patient experience and said, "What are you doing?" And so he came to us and said, "Hey, can you talk to me about my patient experience?" We went in and we talked to them about what they were doing. They'd already had another consulting company in there who gave them this, and asked, "Is this stuff any good? What do we do with all this analysis?" And we said, "We're not really sure, but let's take a look at what you're really thinking about here." So Christian went to the hospital and pretended he had a broken leg and brought a video camera with him, as you saw. We spent about 4 weeks thinking about what was happening inside the company, interviewing people, and in the boardroom, we showed this video for 7.5 minutes. You can imagine how happy the CEO of this company was. He had just paid us a lot of money, and we showed him the video of a ceiling for 7.5 minutes. Yeah? And we said, well, I mean, you asked us to tell you what the patient experience was. That's the patient experience as you're sitting there in the bed. Meanwhile, you have people around you who are talking about you in whispers. You're already scared. We're trying to talk about the human element of the experience. So we were engaged to work with their staff, and they did different kinds of role plays to understand what it was like to be in the shoes of the patient. Here they're mimicking a scanner situation. We also did a bunch of prototyping exercises. So the woman on the right is actually a nurse who was complaining that she spent a lot of her time telling people where the bathroom was, where the cafeteria was, answering questions about hours. And she's like, I really want to help these people, but I'm a trained nurse, and I'm trying to help the patients. And so she made a uniform for a guide. Maybe we need the role of guide in a hospital. And so she had this kind of uniform, and she has guide down her pants so that people would be able to leave her alone to do her job. Someone else who was a patient recently mocked up this hospital bed. You're in a hospital, someone's typically pushing you from behind. And again, you're kind of scared. You might be going to a different room. You're changing. You don't really know what's happening. And they built this mock mirror. It's like a bicycle mirror. So they can see the person and have a human connection with the person behind them and have a conversation while they're going through this quite scary experience. We also did little tricks kind of in the hospital, the delineation of the corridor from the room. And how does that change the fact that this is my space and this is the corridor, and when you cross that space, there's a different interaction that should happen. We also painted the walls with whiteboard paint so that when people came and the patient was asleep, they could leave messages, kind of like inspired by the cast. Sometimes people write on people's casts. It turned out, however, this was also being used by the doctors and nurses. So when the doctor would change shift, he would leave a little note for the nurse on the whiteboard. And all of a sudden, the communication improved, and the effectiveness of the treatments also improved. We've done things with operating rooms, the whole patient journey, not just what's happening when you're in the hospital, but how about beforehand, just before admittance, about insurance, about at the time when you're in the hospital, afterwards, the insurance afterwards, looking at the whole patient journey. This is one of my favorite quotes from a previous client of ours. Yeah? This is particularly apt for Singapore, right? So the idea that there's a bunch of analysis that can be done and should be done. And there's the other side here, which is kind of the human side. I'll give you one more example that I think is actually quite poignant for the fact that it's quite hard-hitting from a financial standpoint. This is not just all touchy-feely, not just all about the person, but also about the business model itself, the business design, if you will. So Bank of America came to us and asked us this question: how do we develop a new path for revenue growth for women with kids in the US? Not the most exciting brief in the world, but we took a bunch of time and we did what we call kind of unfocused groups. This is not a focus group where you pay someone $50 for an hour of their time, in which case you often don't get the kind of true feelings and behaviors, especially when it's about things like healthcare and money, people don't talk about. So typically dinner events or drinks events where we kind of just talk to people about what's happening. Sometimes we prototype live with them. And we found a couple of different very interesting behaviors. One of which was this. Now, this would never happen in Singapore, and I'll tell you what the result of that is. But this is a woman who was writing her check to her energy company, and her check is $27.40, but she's writing a check for $30. That's curious. Like, we asked her, why did she do that? And at first she told us that, well, it was easier to balance her checkbook, and kind of made some other kind of reasons. And then we said, well, but these days, don't you do your checkbook digitally? And she said, yes. I said, okay, well, that can't really be the reason. And she said, okay, well, to be honest, I write the check, I round up to actually feel kind of in control. Now the power company owes me money, right? And all of a sudden, we find a real interesting insight and behavior below this. This is also leveraging existing behavior. You come home, you throw your change in the drawer. And so what we did was we built this service for Bank of America called Keep the Change. Every time you went into a store to buy something, if it was $21.42, it would round up to $22, sweep that change, if you will, into a current account, and match it up to $200 a year. Pretty interesting. This was a huge rollout in San Francisco. Here are the results, though. Quite impressive. This is, again, not just about fluffy stuff, not just the soft stuff, but you need to get to that stuff in order to get to the hard numbers. 12 million new customers in 18 months, $3.5 to $3.2 billion saved. So the other thing we do is we think to build, and we build to think. So we do a lot of thinking and a lot of kind of behavior analysis to try to figure out what to build, but we also start building before we're actually done thinking. Prototyping, right? This is for the TSA. Anyone who's ever visited the US and had a lovely experience in one of our airports can thank us for thinking about this. So look at this old curmudgeon, right? This woman is obviously terrified for her first trip. And we wanted to think about, well, the idea here is that the security for you is a process for the organization, and security for me, the passenger, is actually an emotion. And why do we have to be gruff like this bouncer guy when we can be actually quite nice like this forest ranger? They're changing the tone of the interaction. And we mocked up all kinds of different space elements. This is all cardboard. This is a mock-up that we're working for, trying to figure out how much time is it going to go through, what kind of information I'm going to give people as we go along. So we're designing the experience. We took away the kind of barriers between the security people and us to make it a more human interaction. Now we have the people from the TSA actually prototyping for themselves and thinking about, well, what do we want this experience to be like? More like that, and less like this, yeah? Here's a guy prototyping a new kind of wheelchair for the hospital, and the real stories are the people who really work at the TSA, making them human, and the interaction, therefore, more human. Finally, IDEO is a bunch of designers, and people often ask me, well, what's the difference between a designer and an artist? And I think oftentimes artists are interested in expressing themselves, not that designers aren't, but designers typically are applied artists. They want to bring products and services to market. So we thrive on the idea of getting our things actually into the market. This is not an exercise, an intellectual exercise to try and figure out what the customer needs, but to try and get to actually build a business around it. This is some work we did for Air New Zealand, reinventing their their economy class, also their business class seats. So actual product design here, but really the whole experience around it. And this is now affectionately called Cuddle Class in New Zealand. The seat kind of flips up in economy class for long-haul flights. So, as I mentioned, more and more we're thinking about companies and governments and societies, not just products and services and businesses. We've been working with the White House on vegetable gardens and food and obesity in the US. And we ask one question a lot, and that question is, how might we? This is an imaginative question, trying to imagine what might be possible, how we might get there, forgetting about the feasibility at the start, or the viability, but figuring out what's the desirability, what do we want to happen, how might we change things? So the questions we asked of and for Singapore, we've been here about 3 years, doing a ton of work for the government, were for these different divisions, for the Ministry of Manpower, the Ministry of Health, Changi Hospital, MCYS, etc. We're trying to move from the kind of KPI-driven experience that is here in Singapore to one that's more human and brings the people back into the conversation. Last year, our theme was all about, we call it putting the social back in, putting the social back in social society. And we redesigned, we asked a couple different questions. How might we create a world that has experience for the mom's work pass division? So most of you probably have never been here because you're residents, but if you have to go and get a work pass like myself, you go to this facility that we designed. The interesting thing about this facility, however, is not the fact that it's not just a physical space. I mean, it's quite nice, if I do say so myself, but it's efficient, and we designed not just the physical space, but the interaction that happens between people, especially in a situation, again, where you're foreign and it's a little bit scary. How can we put a nicer face and a nicer interaction around the experience? We also didn't just design the space, but the interaction, but also the organization behind the people who are delivering the interaction in that space. And furthermore, we designed the IT infrastructure behind the organization, behind the people, the interaction behind the space. And so starting to think about systems of, holistic systems of service and experience, not just a single product, but how does that product get used? What's the experience of buying it, marketing it, having it, recycling it, and going back again? What's the whole system, yeah? So we also did a bunch of prototyping around kind of healthcare, and we asked the question, how might we enable people to make better decisions and more decisions, better and more informed decisions about their healthcare, taking all the complexity out of it and creating tools. This will be rolling out in the next couple months. How might you improve the clinic experience itself and the caregivers? And how might we speak to Singaporeans' aspirations about home, thinking about the future of housing and what does it mean to HDB, what does HDB mean to a new generation of Singaporeans who may be marrying later or single or living with their parents longer or have different needs and aspirations than their parents. We worked with social assistants to redefine the relationship between social assistants and the needy in Singapore. And we looked at the grants application process for Spring, one of the sponsors of this conference. How do I, as a small, medium business in Singapore, get access to the funds available to help my startup? And there are an endless number of schemes that are available. We simplified that process. So that's kind of the way that we think about work, how we work, and some of the things we've done so far. At the end, I'll take questions. But before that, I wanted to have a little call to action. So our chief creative officer actually grew up in Singapore, and his father told him that Singapore is an optimistic country, which I tend to believe is quite true. It's also, however, a very pragmatic country. Those two things, optimism and pragmatism, tend to be, we kind of view those as ideal characteristics for designing a new future. So who knows what Open IDEO is? Not very many at all. So Open IDEO is a platform that IDEO developed for open innovation. We typically issue a challenge, like the one you see here, from a host nation or a host company, but it is a challenge to the whole world to design together, not just social media, not just tweets, but actual inspirations, actual designs, actual realizations, and then actual opportunities for funding on the back end. Yeah, so this is the current Open IDEO platform, and the current question. Check it out, get some practice, because it's coming to Singapore soon. Can't tell you exactly when or what the challenge will be, but it's coming shortly. So I just want to say thank you. If you have any questions, we have about 15 minutes of time to do questions, and I'd love to take those questions.
This is David from TEDx Singapore. So I've been a VC here for a long time and around the world. And I guess one of the big challenges always is how do you get people out of the box, especially if you talk about the organizational box, right? So if you want to innovate, means do things differently. And you do a lot of work within the organizations. And how do you get people to really get out of their boxes and to explore possibilities?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the question. I think there's a lot of different ways. One is literally to get out of the building, as we've been hearing, right, from Steve Blank. There are lots of different kind of exercises to kind of change people's perspective. Sometimes we do what we call empathy boot camps, right? So in San Francisco, there's a neighborhood called The Mission, which is populated largely by immigrants. Oftentimes, they don't have bank accounts. And some executives from a big bank said, hey, we want to give bank accounts to those people. Can you help us think about how to give bank accounts to those people? And we said, sure. But first, here's a check for $100. We want you to go into The Mission and try and cash it and send it to your imaginary relatives in Honduras or Mexico. And they said, well, why would we try and do that? And we said, well, because in order to understand how to give them bank accounts, you have to understand what they're trying to go to. And so this is a way of putting the executives who probably live in penthouses and have drivers in the actual shoes of people who don't even have a bank account and are trying to send money across the world. Yeah? And so this kind of empathy boot camp was a couple hours. We sent them out in their suits into The Mission with a $100 check and watched them get frustrated within 10 minutes. And then some of them kind of got clever and thought, well, maybe I'll take this to my own bank where I can pull out my credit card and say this, and then they have $100. So they got the first thing done, but now they have no way to send it, right? And so we do a lot of exercises and kind of role playing to get people out of their regular boxes, if you will.
Hi, I'm Karthik from the Singapore University of Technology and Design. When we go about designing products, there's often a distinction between an expressed need and a latent need.
Yes.
How do you get to the latent needs as you go through your process?
Great. So sometimes there are expressed needs, meaning things that people say that they think they want or need. And then there's the underlying need that I was talking about with this kind of woman who was looking for control. So I think it was Henry Ford who said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? That's the expressed need. They had no way to actually tell them about the fact that they wanted a car. So there are a number of different kind of interview techniques that we use that are far more human and far more connecting than they are kind of about this transaction that I'm paying you for an opinion on my cereal or on my product. So there's interviewing techniques, and then there are actual behavioral visits. Sometimes IDEO people actually go and stay in people's houses for 24 hours or 48 hours and watch them use different products or watch them use different services so we can see what they're actually doing as opposed to what they tell you that they're doing. Sometimes they don't mean to not tell you, they just don't know how to express it, they never thought about it before, and we have a number of people inside that are psychologists, anthropologists that are trained to watch for behaviors that are different or latent than what people actually say that they do or think or want.
Hi, I'm Adrian from Advantage. Basically, just to understand, being an entrepreneur, you have good services. So how do you guys start selling your services? Because I think all these are brilliant ideas, but I think a lot of entrepreneurs here have also brilliant ideas. So our first few blocks is to get the business in. How do we pitch for that? Or how do you start marketing it before it become probably word of mouth later on? But how do you start?
How do you start
selling your services across this? Because
IDEOs or yours?
How do you, as in IDEO started your story?
Right. So obviously quite a big difference between IDEO and a startup. We have a huge established brand. We don't do a whole lot of marketing. People tend to call us when they have problems they can't figure out what to do. But as far as how a startup might do it, a lot of the advice that we've been getting here today I think is fantastic advice, which is to go out into the street and do these kind of interviews and do these kind of observations and behavior watching that you can find a problem that you want to have a solution for. A lot of times I see entrepreneurship contests or weekends, and what happens is there's a bunch of technologies, right? And they give them to a bunch of students and say, okay, we have these technologies, now go find a use for them. It's kind of backward, right? It's great that we have engineers that can create amazing things. Oftentimes designers are guilty of this as well. Hey, I made this really cool thing. But the question is, does anybody want it? And more importantly, will anyone buy it, right? If you start with the need, then you can design the solution. And while you're designing the solution, you can start asking people, Would you buy it? How much would you pay for it? Oh, you say you'd pay $50? Would you give me $50 right now? No. Okay, well, you just said you'd give me $50. Yeah, but you don't have it yet. Okay, well, would you put down a deposit? Right? You're trying to find a way to get across the threshold where you can demonstrate to possible funders or other people that, look, I have 300 people behind me who said they want it. I have 300 emails, or I have 300 deposits, or I have 4,000 click-throughs, right? You're trying to get some kind of traction. From an IDEO standpoint, we tend to spend a lot of time in the business development process, talking to the company that wants to hire us to make sure they understand what they're actually buying, right? A lot of them have been through other consulting companies, or they've kind of done all the analysis and they're stuck, and they think that they see IDEO in a different way, but sometimes the way of working that we do, which is oftentimes very ambiguous, kind of staying in, a colleague of mine has a lovely saying that one of the things that's valuable about IDEO is that we tend to stay in the ambiguity longer. We have stamina to stay in the ambiguity, just like a lot of entrepreneurs, right? We stay there longer and try harder until the problem kind of resolves itself, like a good piece of music. Other questions? A couple, one there, one here.
Good afternoon. I'm Ihan from Nanyang Entrepreneurship Center. We talk a lot about the bank, the product design. I'm curious to know for consumer industry, for example, in Singapore, there are a lot of shopping centers. How can we create that unique or cool customer experience towards the mass people?
Right.
Thank you.
Can I change your question to how might we?
Yes, how might we?
Great.
Thank you.
So actually, one of my colleagues recently gave a speech on the future of retail, which is actually all about taking it not just from the, I mean, of course we create spaces, you saw the EPSC, we also create the interactions, but again, this is kind of looking at the whole customer journey. What happens before you get to the shop, what happens afterwards, what's the service relationship or the warranty relationship or the customer service relationship after that, what's the brand promise, and how also is that company designed from a business model perspective, from an organizational model perspective. Are the employees that work there actually happy and therefore delivering good service, or they're actually not incentivized in the right way to think about delivering the service that you want them to design, right, to deliver? Again, I mentioned the EPSC. We didn't just design the interaction between the people who are coming and the people who are giving the service, but the organization behind the interaction, right? That means proper kind of training and development. That means proper incentive structures and a purpose behind the organization, right? If you think about that center, in some ways it's really the heart, it's a huge part of Singapore's economy. Something like 40% of the workers here are foreign workers, and if they have a bad experience coming to Singapore, why wouldn't they go to Dubai, right? And the Singapore government recognizes, oh, like we're actually in a competitive game for the best workers in the world, and so we should be treating them like the customers that they are of Singapore and Singapore services. It's quite enlightened. And so we designed all these different things behind the center there, and you can do the same thing for retail.
Hi. In the light of what you've been saying so far, perhaps you'd like to share with us specifically on the idea behind IDEO. Did you wake up early in the morning and say, this is something that I should do, or is it something that has evolved, yeah?
Yeah.
And secondly, in the light of your identification of the opportunity, do you have players already in the marketplace? How do you know that you're going to build a better mousetrap?
Yeah. So IDEO is about 35 or 40 years old. It was founded in Silicon Valley by some professors of product design and mechanical engineering at Stanford. It did the first mouse, the first laptop computer. It had a history of product design, literally physical stuff. Over time, it moved into kind of service design, interaction design, experience design, the interaction between people and organizations, and later on kind of into more strategy or business strategy, how to design a business, and then again, looking at societies themselves. So when we go out, how do we know we're going to build a better mousetrap? In some sense, we don't, except for the fact that we've done it a lot of times, right? That's obviously someone's paying you quite a bit of money, and you have promised that you're going to build them something that's better than what they've had before. We have certain methodologies and processes and practices, of course. But the truth be told, we don't always know. And sometimes we mess up, not very often. But we're willing to kind of typically say, hey, we messed up, or we went down the wrong path early on. It's that, again, that ability to kind of stay in the ambiguity where it feels terrible and where you're scared that you might not deliver to this client that just paid you a lot of money. It's that ability that, again, you have to have as an entrepreneur as well, to kind of stay in the fear and stay in that ambiguity and kind of keep going. Again, of course, we have methodologies and processes that help us, as do entrepreneurs these days, thanks to Steve Blank and Eric Ries. But that's kind of that is part of the value there, yeah?
Thank you to Teddy Zmrhal.
Thank you.